we were at the campus. I don't know if you remember this. We were sitting outside at the lake during working time and we were just chatting, and you told me about the idea of, I want to show people that you can be a woman and you can look and feel like a woman, but you can also be an athlete. And you were telling me about this vision of having this ball gown and like high heels and playing basketball in a ball gown and high heels. And now this year, subhanallah, 3 years even later, you are on all the billboards with a ball gown playing basketball.
That was crazy. We ended up playing, but the other team, they did a thing where it's called playing under protest. So it means that if we win, they can kind of flag it and say that, you know, we had our hijabs on, which does not, there's no correlation between the two. I mean, my hijab is, you know, but it's not a cape, so it's not going to help me win.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Shared Diversity. If you are new, salam, my name is Sina. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you have been here, thank you so much for coming back. Today we have a very special guest. We have Asma Elbadawi, and I'm excited to chat with her about women in sports, her own journey into sports and arts, her working with brands like Adidas, and us just chit-chatting because we've just known each other for a while, but never really sat down for a podcast that can also contribute to others. So I'm excited to do that today. Asma, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
How we always start this podcast is, could you introduce yourself for those who don't know you in 30 seconds?
Sure. So I'm Asma Elbadawi. I'm Sudanese. I was raised in the UK. I'm an artist, a poet, and I'm also a sports inclusivity consultant and an Adidas ambassador.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your journey? And that is both in terms of like sports and arts. How did you get into it in the first place? We can start with sports for now.
Sure. So I've played sports like my entire life since I was like really young. And a lot of it was because of where we lived. All the kids kind of used to go outside and we play loads of sports together, and we'd like play on our bikes and all these different kind of games. Some of the games were like really like unique to the different backgrounds that some of the kids were, and they shared them with us, and we just used to kind of like play all these games. But also in school, I was in every single after school club. My parents like really encouraged us to kind of get involved in all of that stuff, and I'm the youngest of two, so my brother was like obsessed with football, so he always like make me go outside and like stand in the goal, and he would just kick the ball so hard, you know. And then we kind of take turns doing that. But for me, sports was like a huge expression of like myself. It gave me like a lot of joy, and I just continued to do it like even after I finished school and after university.
That's amazing. And what kind of sports do you play? So those people who don't know yet.
So I played netball mostly up until leaving high school. And then after that, I mostly did basketball.
So getting into basketball, did you like start playing already with girls, or did you usually play with guys? Because like knowing here from Germany, I think if you would just like grow up, I mean, you know, like not a place like London, but if you would grow up like I did in a small town, there wouldn't be a proper like women's basketball team at that time. And you would have, if you're interested in these kind of sports, like you would have to compete with boys and guys later on. So how did you get into it?
I think the first time that I got into it was when my mom's friend's son, they left the country and then they left me a basketball. And I didn't really like basketball, by the way. Like I didn't like defense. I hated people defending me. I just like shooting because it was so similar to netball. So I used to just go outside and like we'd play these shooting games for hours, like hours. And it was with the boys and the girls, and like all of us would just kind of do that. But then we had a year where a coach, I think she was doing her qualifications. So she had to do like 10 weeks of experience. And she came and she tested at our school. I only remembered like years later when me and her ended up being in a tournament together. for me, basketball was not my favorite sport. It was just a sport that I thought was really cool, but then I ended up really, really loving it a bit too much.
Why a bit too much?
I think when I got into it, it was at a time where like I hadn't been playing sports for 2 years. I was really unsure about like the jurisdiction around women, especially Muslim women, and playing sports. I hadn't seen anyone on the TV, like in the WNBA, the Olympics, and all these kind of like competitions wearing hijab. So I felt like I'd only been allowed to play because of the school that I went to was all Muslim girls' school. It was very kind of controlled in the sense of like men didn't come in and out. And so I was kind of like in this big ball of confusion. And then I trialed for the team because I didn't make the netball team. And then I got accepted onto the team. So for that first year, I was kind of like really, training all the time. And I didn't want to stop there. Like I ended up going to like camps abroad, and like when I got in, I super got in,
When you
like,
commit,
this
you
is for
commit.
life. Yeah.
So when did you find out that there were actually regulations against wearing the hijab, and how did you get into then overturning them? I mean, that's a longer story, but I do want people to kind of like feel that part of your journey, because it could be, I feel as a former an athlete that wanted to go professional, it would be so frustrating to just know you've worked so hard, you trained so hard, and there's this kind of like always thought about, okay, can I actually play professionally or not? Because the only person I see is myself and my friends doing it. And then figuring out like there are actually like rules that need to be overturned. Actually getting into that state of saying, you know what, why not me? Why not me changing the rules in the game?
I think for me, I played for such a long time without the rules really being flagged. I think they got flagged once in a different part of the UK when me and my friends were playing. But our coach was just kind of like, well, they train hard and they play, so they're going to play, And we ended up playing, but the other team basically did a thing where it's called playing under protest. So it means that if we win, they can kind of, I don't know, like flag it and say that, we had our hijabs on, which does not there's no correlation between the two. I mean, my hijab is, but it's not a cape, so it's not going to help me win.
Unless you wear a abaya, then people could actually say, it's like a cape, it has superpowers.
Right.
The audacity, the audacity of saying like, if we win, it's fine, but if we lose, we'll make you pay.
It was really funny, but so it never got flagged. And I think because we were training all the time and like really putting in the effort, our coaches as well, like never really looked into it. And I also lived in a community that was very Muslim. There was a lot of Muslim people, diverse, like from different backgrounds. There was like the Libyans, the Sudanese, there was like the from Pakistani community. So it just felt normal for our coaches as well. So they didn't even look into it. But then eventually I started with the poetry, and with the poetry, I was like traveling up and down, doing a lot of media. And then somehow I ended up being on a call with a professional basketballer who was called Indira. I mean, she's still called Indira, but I met her. We were talking on the phone, and we were gonna do like a creative project together. And for some reason, in the middle of it, I started talking about basketball, and she was like, "Wait, you play basketball?" And I was like, "Yeah, I play basketball. Do you?" And she told me about her career and playing professionally overseas, but then she wore the hijab and she was not allowed to play anymore. And she invited me.
When was that? Like, how long did she actually play until she wasn't allowed to play anymore?
She played for quite a lot of years. She was around my age, but she'd been playing her whole life. Like the kind who play basketball or play college basketball, and then after college they go pro.
Yeah.
So that's what she did. And then anyway, she invited me to be part of it, and I didn't even need to think twice. I was just like, whoa, like a lot of things popped into my head in that moment, and I realized that, okay, that I didn't see anyone look like me. That's why all these competitions, there's no Muslim women wearing the hijab, and it has nothing to do with their religion. And I just felt like I needed to be part of something that the next generations can come and play and not have the same barriers as us.
I feel like there's a big difference between focusing on your own sports and then focusing on what comes after. Because when you look at the trajectory of most professional athletes, they can focus on their own careers for most of their careers. And when they retire, they can start thinking about what can I leave behind? What can I change for the people coming after me? But having to juggle focusing on your own career and investing time and effort into training and developing yourself, plus also the entire amount of like activism and figuring out how to actually overturn those rules to eventually play, like you have to do double of the work. I can just imagine it being so overwhelming for that kind of a project. How do you start overturning rules? Like, can you explain that a little bit more?
I think you need a plan first. Like, it wasn't something that we just jumped into. I remember we had a meeting, it was me, Indira, and another like 10 athletes that were all Muslim, and they were all in like different places in the world. And we also had someone with us who was from, I think, change.org. And together we kind of were informed to all write our own petitions and then share them. But what they did was they linked all of our like signatures, so that like if I got signatures, or Izdihar was with us, she got signatures, and like the other girls who got signatures, all these numbers would add up. So then what that meant was it would go like further up in the agenda kind of thing, and it would reach like FIBA. And so that's what we kind of did. And we also had a lot of contacts that were like already, for example, like brands that were already creating sports hijab at the time, who also joined our campaign. And then it was a lot of sort of like just advocating all the time. So for me, I was like already on the TV, already doing radio. So while I was doing things, I was just like further kind of sharing more about myself in those situations, and then telling them I'm actually doing this campaign, and like passing the message on, And during the time, it didn't feel like overwhelming. It just felt like I have a camera and I'm taking pictures all the time about something that I really cared about and just posting them. But now I couldn't do that again. Like I could never probably do a campaign that big again in my life. That's how I feel.
Because there was so much work?
I think like when you're in the middle of it, you don't feel how much effort you're putting in. And then after, you're sort of like, wow, I'm really exhausted. Like that was really tiring. But at the time, it was just kind of like, it just became like second nature, I think I really believed in the cause, and that's why I barely rested. It was like constantly on my mind. We were sort of waiting for FIBA at one point to accept the hijabs that we sent them, because we sent them some hijabs that were sort of like they'd already done research in them, and they've made sure that they're breathable and they like meet the safety regulations, and and then they kept delaying as well, and then eventually it was just kind of like, oh yeah, well done, you've changed the rule. But there was no like party, or there was no like
yeah, like the satisfaction is kind of missing. But it's actually fun because fun to hear like your side of the story, because what I tell a lot of people is when you want to change something in your life, or you want more career or life opportunities, you need to build a personal brand around it, and ideally it should be rooted in something deeper than I want to promote myself. So the fun thing is that I got to know you through that campaign, as I believe a lot of your audience actually got to know you through just advocating for that change. So you actually put yourself as a personal brand out there already as someone who wants to drive change in their industry, who wants to change something for the better, who's up for like inclusivity as well as helping women just do, be their best in their field. And this happened to be the sports field, because why would they have to have it more difficult just because they decide to cover their hair? Which is like, that's literally the conversation we're having here. You have to work twice as hard just because you're covering your hair. So it's really interesting to see that kind of example of how a personal brand can guide you to a place where you can change things, where you can make a name for yourself, but you can actually also change the game. And the recognition might not have been like, you get this trophy, good work for changing the rules, but it does add up to your legacy, and how people view you and what kind of opportunities you get after that. So the kind of connecting to that, because that is also something that brought you into kind of the realm of also big brands that want to make a change. Can you tell us a bit more about your journey of working with Adidas?
Sure. So the irony of it all was, when we used to play basketball, me and my friends, all my friends would make jokes, to each other where they'd be like, oh, are you sponsored by so and so? Are you sponsored by, whatever? If someone came in with a full kit from a specific brand. And I never made those jokes. And like it never occurred to me that I would even work with brand, and especially like Adidas. So I remember like when I first like when they first reached out, and then we were kind of going through the contracts, I didn't tell anyone except my mom. And I think my brother like he wanted to literally write it on Facebook. And I was like, don't. And I was like, you have to wait till everything is like cleared and the contract sent back and everything. But for me, it was like a huge opportunity, because it basically like it took my voice exactly how it was in terms of the poetry, in terms of the basketball and sports, and just amplified it and took it to like a much wider audience. And I think I wouldn't have been able to do that on my own, not at this stage anyway, because I didn't have that kind of reach, to be able to reach people in Dubai, to reach people in Australia and all these different places. So, as soon as that partnership kind of started, I was able to like share a lot of my ideas with Adidas, and they were able to like see where I'd fit in and which campaigns they feel like they could use a lot of the gifts that I have. So like there was the swimming one. I think you were the one who invited me to do that one. And for me, it was amazing, like being able to sit and work with other people to create a poem that wasn't just, personal to me, but also very universal. And flying out in the middle of COVID to film that. And I was like the only one flying out. So I was like, yo guys, I'm going on holiday. But yeah, like it was just like a push that helped me also realize that my voice can impact more people than I thought.
Yeah. And I love that you say it took all what you've been doing and just amplified it, because I remember when I remember this moment, we were at the campus, and at the time I was there in a position of, I was interviewing you every time, athletes or ambassadors or brand partners would come to the campus, I would interview them. So I was really excited for you to come so we could have a chat. But I don't know if you remember this, we were sitting outside at the lake, and we were basically the only ones. I don't know, it was still like spring, so it wasn't super hot, and it was during working time, and we were just chatting, and you told me about the idea of, I want to show people that you can be a woman and you can look and feel like a woman, but you can also be an athlete. And you were telling me about this vision of having this ball gown and like high heels and playing basketball in a ball gown and high heels. And now this year, subhanallah, 2 years or 3 years even later, you are on all the billboards with a ball gown playing basketball.
That was crazy.
It's just crazy to think back and see like That's the vision you had.
Yeah, and I think what I didn't expect was the feedback that I actually got from other people. And there was a lot of parents who contacted me like around that time and were just like, our little daughters saw these billboards and they wanted to know who the princess was. And like that opened this conversation to like, she plays basketball and she's done
Yeah.
this and that and she does poetry. And then it was kind of like, it's not your typical princess who's, you know, fighting off men trying to get a prince. Or
Oh,
whatever
that's
stories
beautiful.
they've been telling kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful, subhanAllah. It's nice to see your progression because you've been really vocal about what you wanted to do, and it's not very easy in, you know, working with brands, working on your own personal brand to kind of find that where you still feel like yourself, but you're also, you know, in terms of like the brand, you're both looking at what purpose do we both have, but what's the goal we have with this campaign or even with the product. Does this product have the message and the kind of like intention that I want to, you know, drive as well with my personal brand? So it's really beautiful to see someone that has kind of, you know, brought that in and also like embodies it. And I do love the swim campaign that you were in, because when the swim team came to me very early on, I think it was in the first year that I started consulting, and they came with this idea of saying, you know, this is a problem that women have. Obviously, you know about it. And they came with the example of France banning women from wearing the burkini to the beach and actually fining women for doing so. And they said, what can we do about it? This is our idea. Can you help us develop the product? So I was really excited to work on the product and then seeing it come to life and then seeing people test it. And then you being on that, you know, campaign cover, and not only just being the person that wears it and says like, it's a great product, buy it, but actually developing this poem that looked at so much more than just the product or this one target market that initially was the idea to reach. So the idea was to solve this problem for Muslim women, but when you came up with the campaign poem, it looked and it felt like, yes, this is a solution for multiple women. It's not just for women who wear the hijab. It's for women who, you know, wear modestly, who wear inclusive sizing, who might have disabilities or skin condition. And it just like creates a more accessibility to actually access this beautiful sport. So can you tell us a bit more about you being an artist as well as an athlete and how you bring this together? Because one of the questions that I always get from people that want to build a personal brand is, I have so many different passions, how do I bring it all together? And I think you are a beautiful example of how you do that, and it feels very natural. Knowing that you're not only the athlete on a lot of campaigns, but you're actually also the artist, and like writing the poetry, thinking about the conception and like the images and the videography about the campaigns that you're in. So tell us a bit more about you as an artist, how you feel you can bring those different identities and strengths into your brand and what you do.
So it's a hard question.
Yeah.
For me, I think like because I studied photography and video, so while I was like at university studying this, I was also playing basketball. And a lot of the stories that I wanted to tell and was telling anyway was women in sports and women who are athletes. But I was also trying to like break down my own identity and figure out who I am as a Sudanese Muslim woman and lives in the UK. So there was always these like layers of stories that I was always trying to say and share through the camera, but at the same time I was writing poetry, so things that I couldn't express in film I would express through writing and vice versa. So I kind of already had that like storytelling, I suppose, in me, but before the brand Asma, you know, Elbadawi kind of like fully formed, but I didn't know what I was doing with it. As in, there was no plan. It was just more of a, okay, I like telling these kind of stories, and these are the kind of poems that I like to tell, and I'm just going to keep doing them. It's only, I would say, like in the last sort of year or 2 years that I've been able to like really sit down and kind of see like, okay, my strengths are in creative things and like sports stuff, and giving room for each one to, you know, be itself. I struggle a lot with finding the balance. I didn't when I was at uni because everything had a time and a place. But now I feel like I struggle. And I think the reason is because I feel like I'm trying to tell bigger stories than I was previously. Before it was very me, the girls around me, and now it's kind of like I'm trying to tell stories about the wider world, and I'm stopping more and more, you know, and having to think and having to think, okay, how am I gonna tell these stories? So what I've actually started doing a lot more is like creating things that are not made for social media. They're just made for me. And just sitting in my studio while I've been on a residency for the last year, I've just been able to like do therapy in a way, and sit with myself and just tell the stories that I experience every day, that I feel like I need to just get out there so that I can tell the bigger stories that I actually want to tell.
Yeah.
But also to get more confident being behind the camera, because I think for a good like 5-6 years, I've always been the one in front of the camera, and I lost being behind the camera and that ability and the confidence to be behind it. So this year for me has been like a rediscovering Asma behind the camera year.
Yeah, I love that. Can you tell us about one big struggle you had as an artist and how you overcame it along your journey?
I think the biggest struggle that I have as an artist is probably like trying to share things that are happening in the moment. So there's things like mental health, for example, that I want to talk about, but then I can't talk about them because I'm too in the moment. So what I've started to do, especially this year, was make sure that like I take the pictures myself, so that I don't have the pressure of like having to, you know, work with someone else and be there in a specific time and take the pictures. You know, I can set up the camera myself and then just put the timer on. And the other thing is I stopped thinking about quality. I started thinking more about, okay, can I use a point and shoot camera? Can I use just like put the camera on auto or whatever, like whatever the easiest thing I can do to make the picture and tell the story. That's helped me like the most, because I think I always got stuck on how do I make a perfect image or how do I make a perfect video. And then that was it, you know, that's where I'd get stuck. But as an artist, that's what helped me the most, like letting go of perfection, letting go of the idea that, you know, an image has to be, you know, in color as well. I put color in my last like work, and it just helped so much.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is a really big one, because I think people are struggling when they're looking at their personal brand. There is the sharing, there's the telling, and then there's the showing, right? The showing is through vlogs, you know, behind the scenes, what do I do with my work? The telling is this is what I would tell, like would do if I would be in this situation, where you basically tell them about your expertise and you share tips. And the sharing is more, I share my emotions, my feelings, my stories. And I personally have always looked at you with a lot of admiration, mashallah, because you share a lot of things that are very deep, and that you are struggling still with. And I'm always the person who, and I think there's two approaches. Probably I'm just not, you know, it's there's like this barrier between me and the outside world, where I just can't share something unless it's I entirely have like left it behind. I've learned from it. I now can share about it. And that's something that I am struggling with. And I think it's more because I fear that I'm not in a position to share it, because I'm not, like, I'm still kind of like processing it, or I am like, why would I even share it? It wouldn't even help anyone because I obviously can't deal with it, or I haven't figured out this problem that I'm struggling with yet. So seeing you talk about things that you have been struggling with, but that are still kind of within your life and in like every day in the everyday routine, is something that's really inspiring for me, where I'm like, okay, like the world is also beautiful. I can see comments of people being inspired and saying, thank you for talking about this. Maybe I should think about these kind of stories a bit more and push myself to talk about struggles that I've been going through as well. But how was that a process? Was that always the case where you're like, I share it? Maybe it's, for some people, it's part of their therapy or processing to just share it or put it into stories. I know that a lot of your stories are inspired and like driven by your life experience, that's why they are so impactful. So has it always been part of your storytelling, or did you also have to find into it?
To be honest, like a lot of the poems that I used to write when I was a lot younger were very depressing and sad. And I remember like one of my friends told me, I can't wait till you start writing like happy poems and like poems about other things. And I didn't realize what it meant until like a long time later. And then I could actually tap into like all kinds of different emotions. With writing and with my style of writing anyway, I have to tap into different sides of me. And sometimes I need some of how I still feel there so that I can be authentic in my writing. And if I'm still not in that place, I tend to go back to that place mentally to write. But I don't share everything and anything with everyone. Like there's certain people who I would never share things with because for me, I feel like they don't have the skills. I don't like to have a conversation with someone who then tells me just eat. And I'm like, yeah, that's the problem. I can't just eat. And I don't like to have conversations with people who are like, oh, how's your salah? Is your salah not okay? Maybe you should focus on your salah. So I'm very selective. But then there's some spaces where I know like if I post on like my social media, certain platforms, people are more open to hear about other people's struggles. And I don't mind. I don't mind doing that. But also as a poet, like when I started sharing, I always shared to a bigger audience. And I felt like that was less scary than sitting one to one with a friend and sharing. So when I share to a wide group, I can say what I want to say and just kind of disappear if I want to.
Yeah.
But if you're sharing it, it's like a one-on-one, and then the other person's like, "Oh, tell me a little bit more," and you're like, "Oh, I really don't want to," and then it becomes like a discussion.
Yeah.
So I've always found it much easier to share to a wider audience than a smaller one.
Yeah. You kind of like share it and then you bounce, and then you can give that. That's how I do it. If I share something that's a bit too personal, I just share it. I leave it there and then I close my internet, like my Wi-Fi. Sometimes I delete all my apps from my phone, and then after 3 days, I'm like, okay, let's see how people.
Okay, I never did to that point where I'm deleting apps, but I have done it where I'm like, okay, I made a post. Okay, bye. I do it less now because now I'm kind of like I look forward to looking at other people's opinions, seeing how they feel, and you always get someone who's like, my brother is going through this, or my friend is going through this, or I'm going through this, and then by the end of like the day, you're sort of like, oh, I'm not the only one. I can accept that.
Yeah. So how do you feel? Because we're talking a lot about your professional career, working with brands, building a personal brand around your identity and what you really love doing and your interests and passions. How has building your personal brand helped you in your life and career?
Ooh. I think it's given me purpose in the sense of like, I understand what kind of content I do want to create and what content I don't want to create. I think like when you go online, you're bombarded with like so much kind of content. You have like the entertaining content, the like facts content, the like fashion or whatever, like all these different things. And before you know it, you can get sucked into like, what does the algorithm like and what does the algorithm not like? And I think for a couple of years, maybe I started to struggle with that, where it was like I was starting to lose my own voice in that space because I wanted to grow my audience. And that felt more important than actually having a proper message every time. And now, like, I think it was like during this past year where I've had to like sit down and, you know, think about who am I as a person, what messages do I want to share to the world, not just as Asma, but also as a Muslim. You know, like we all kind of believe that once we leave this life, we should leave a good legacy behind us. And, you know, for me, I don't want to leave this world and have like just videos of me like dancing around online. Not that there's anything wrong with that, you know, for people who enjoy that. But for me, that's not what I want to leave behind. So it's allowed me to really like just point like, this is what I want to do. This is the stories I want to say. These are the people that I'm going to work with to make those stories like happen.
I think what you're saying is really important because a lot of times people think personal branding is all about self-promoting, and then you will get that job, you will get hired, you will, you know, get those followers, and that feels really good in the moment, but it's more about what value are you actually providing? Because if you're not providing value, then you are basically building your brand on vanity, and that will attract a certain audience, certain brands, and those brands will then also only look for vanity metrics. For instance, I work with you and this is the amount of products I want you to sell through your audience, or this is the kind of like return I want on my investment, instead of let's build something together, let's tell a story together, let's change something on a bigger scale. And that's really the beautiful thing about having a personal brand, that attracts also businesses and brands, because they have the access to resources that you might not have as a person, but that can really amplify not only your voice, but really your efforts. So when I tell people, you know, my vision is to leave a positive impact for 1 billion women, I'm not doing this by myself. You know, I'm like trying to get 1 billion followers on social media, but I try to strategically work with brands that have a higher, you know, impact, that have that kind of like scale of impact that I want to achieve. And that's the same thing you can have if you are building actually a personal brand on something that has some kind of intention and purpose. So I love that you're kind of framing it in that way. I wanted to talk a little bit more about women that are young girls that are looking up to you. What do you feel like are your 3 tips for young girls and women who want to get into sports or in the sports industry or anything connected to sports? What would you give them on their way to make a name for themselves and build a brand and attract those opportunities?
I think initially I would say focus on the game. Like you only have a certain amount of time to get really good, you know, at a sport and to make it to a professional level. And for a lot of people, they make the mistake of like trying to grow a social media at the same time as, you know, like training and becoming really good. So I would say like the first few years of your career should really be more about the sport, getting good at the sport. And then I think at a certain point when you feel like, okay, you're starting to like play for different teams, you're starting to be noticed or whatever, you can then introduce like the social media aspect, you know, because that's what really gets the brands and all these different things. But because at the same time, you can always just like hit up an agency, you know, when you're still playing. And I think that just allows the sport to be your core, and then everything else to be added on top. Because I feel like once you start building like a social media, you lose a lot of the authenticity, I would say, because then you're trying to keep up with numbers and you're being invited to like do lots of work here and there. Like I have certain friends that I've seen sort of like they want to make championships and they want to do things, but then every week you're seeing them in a different interview or a different, and I'm of the people who feel like the moment you get on a big platform and you play your best, the whole world would know who you are anyway. So it's not about making sure the whole world knows who you are before you have even created the play that you want to be. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing I would always say is like, don't be afraid to be the first one in the room or the only one in the room. There's a lot of times where like you might be the only person in that city or country that's, you know, one wearing a hijab or two just from your background. And I'm always approached by women who tell me like, yo, I couldn't stay in that sport because I couldn't socialize with these girls. You know, they're always out partying on weekends, and you know, they're bonding through alcohol, and I just don't feel like I fit in. But actually, if you stay and you put yourself in leadership positions, you can create a space where, you know, people are socializing in environments that don't involve alcohol. You can suggest these things, and you can show people like different ways of having fun without, you know, having alcohol there. And the last thing I would say is just have fun. You know, like at the end of the day, sports is really about like having fun and learning while having fun. You know, a lot of the skills that I learned in terms of teamwork, in terms of like communication, in terms of like all these different things, I didn't realize I was learning because I was playing basketball while I was doing them. And my coach is basically telling me, tell the player behind you, because they might not be able to see where the player who has ball is, you know. And I'm like saying right or left, or you know, or like help. And later I realized, oh, I was learning to communicate, to say like, as a basketball player right now, I need help because my the person I'm defending is basically about to beat me. But then you can take that into real life where you're like, yo, I'm really struggling with this project. I need help. So that's the like last thing that I would say.
I love the part about communication. I think that's such an important part that we don't really learn, whether that's in our education or even in university. Is kind of, you learn by doing and you learn by failing most of the time, because communication can destroy a lot of relationships, whether that's a personal relationship or with a friend or even with your parents. And then when you get into the workplace, you see, oh, it's like what I said wasn't received very well, or how I said it wasn't received very well. And I feel also sports has contributed a lot to my interpersonal communication skills, to say, you know, like either that's my boundaries, or to say, you know, we are a team, we need to work on this together, or even the different dynamics you have in a team in terms of, this is a leader, this is kind of the, you know, the coach. You shouldn't, you know, compete or challenge the coach too much, which also relates, kind of translates into the work field, where you don't want to outshine the master, as it's said in 48 Laws of Power. It kind of is like this level of communication is so needed, and is, I think, a big part of life and your career. Do you have any specific also tips for women who are not necessarily athletes, but they want to be known in the sports industry? So let's say women that are really interested or semi-professional in sports, or really want to just like work with a sports brand or in the sports industry or sports journalism or activism. What would you tell them and give them on their way on kind of skills that they should work on, or relationships that they should build? How important is networking?
I mean, one of my pet peeves is like when you're in a new team and then the person managing has had no experience in sports at all, and then they're telling you like, oh, you know, on this day we've organized this whatever, and you're like, oh, how does that relate, you know? Or this is a really stupid one, but I feel like I'm really petty and I need to bring it up. but like in basketball we say game, and in other sports they say match. So you'll get like people who tell you, oh, I've organized a match, and you're like, it's not a match, honey, it's a game. So what I would say is kind of like, if you are trying to get into a space where there's already female athletes in there who are either like competing or playing, and you kind of like, I don't know, want to run the business side or all these other sides, it's really important for you to actually understand the sport, go to matches and games and watch these, things, watch stuff on TV, talk to your friends who do play sports, and just don't assume, like a lot of people assume, for example, like if you're a girl that loves sports, you're not going to want to wear a dress and go to a wedding, or a party. But me, I want to go to both, I want to wear the dress and I want to play the sports. And a lot of times, like, girls kind of, I wouldn't say alienate each other, but they will go online, for example, and they'll think, oh, okay, like she's doing sports, I'm not interested in sports, I'm not gonna follow her, I might follow someone else who I have more interests with. But actually, if you want to go into these spaces later, it's so important. And you never know, you might not want to at the time, but later you might decide to. It's just important to be aware of like other women's like interests and sports that they play, because not all sports are the same. Team sports are completely different to individual sports. Individual sports, there's way more pressure on the player, having to like basically build themselves constantly. But then with team sports, you always have the support of your team. But then the other issue as well is like, if one of your team players is not a great team player, it can impact the whole team. So you kind of need people who are managing or who are in those positions to be a lot stronger and to be able to manage the different like dynamics and like issues that pop up.
That's a really good one. I think just assuming things about a person because you feel like you know the sports type is really important, specifically when you work with partners. So this is called the Shared Diversity podcast, and we look at diversity as something that's really important in terms of how it can really impact brands, businesses, and our personal life. And that could be diversity within ourselves, but also of others. So diversity of thoughts, ideas, experiences, and sharing that diversity can really help, create new things, collaborate better, develop innovation. So how would you say, what does the power of diversity mean to you?
The power of diversity in my life just means that you're able to learn and view other people in their own authentic selves, and you're able to share in their joy and their sadness. A lot of times when you bring diverse people into a sport, for example, I'm going to give basketball as an example. Basketball is predominantly seen as a tall people sport. But what happens if you bring people who are like shorter into the game? Like they have a different skill set. So they can use their strength and make the sport more interesting at times, But it also gives them the opportunity to inspire people from their own communities and their own backgrounds, And so I love diversity because I feel like different people bring different things to the table, and it just makes everything really exciting and interesting.
Yeah, it's fun to have someone like challenge your views and just like bring a very different viewpoint into things and thoughts that you haven't really thought about. This actually bridges really well to the questions we've received. So we have a new segment where we actually bring in mentees to learn from you, and I have received a lot of questions, but I wanted to focus on 3 specific questions for you that people want to really hear your perspective from and your ideas from. So the first question is,
hi Asma, my name is Kanisha and I have 3 questions for you today in relation to the sport industry. My first question is, what are your views on positioning of the retired players or athletes in the sport industry? As in, are brands doing well enough according to your point of view to support them very well?
Oh, I think I think they're starting to, mostly because I think there's been a lot of things that have happened over the last year, I would say, in terms of like women's sports. Like we had England win, a couple of weeks ago, and we're needing more like presenters, women in like different kind of fields, that are not on the ground, like playing the sport. So I think now there's a lot more like pathways for former athletes to join and explore. But at the same time, I also think that like it's normally a very difficult time anyway for a lot of athletes. Once they leave sports, they dedicated most of their life to one thing. And, some have an education background, others don't. And then it's time where they really need to figure out what they want to do. So brands can support by, doesn't necessarily have to be that they are giving them full-time jobs, but it could be that they're giving, like smaller positions or workshops or different things for the girls to go in and actually try out a lot of these things, like try out presenting, try out, interviewing other women, and then seeing like, okay, this is a nice fit for me or not. And some women just decide that they don't want anything to do with sports after, and then others will find something that they never thought they'd be really good at and then just be like super amazing at.
Yeah, because usually you see brands only taking advantage of retired athletes if they've been legends, and then they start developing a product line and they become the face of the product line and just like very focused on apparel. But there's not really much else that the industry offers yet. So I really feel like having that kind of setup that you're describing in terms of trying out what you would like to like move into, specifically because when you look at athletes, their peak is around their 30s, and towards 40 it's already retirement age for a lot of sports, and a lot of sports that is when they are going on to do something else. But that's exactly when you would like to still do something with your life, ideally until you fall apart. It's just like, specifically because athletes in their nature are so competitive and high performance, that going away from competing and sports without having anything in as a prospect is really, I could just imagine being really heartbroken. And there are so many things where they can actually bring their expertise in, like you say. The next question we have is,
have you ever experienced any harassment or abuse in the sport industry, especially as a woman?
My first experience of racism actually happened while I was playing basketball. At the time, I didn't wear hijab, but I remember a group of non-people of color were, I don't know what to say.
I think it's a good explanation.
I'll start again. A group of basketball players actually went and they were in a tournament, and when they came back, they kept singing a song at the time that was like something in Paris. And me and another boy, we pointed out that this was like extremely racist and that they shouldn't be like saying it. And then they just kept telling us like, oh, like it was just a song and we were like singing it and it's fine. But they actually remixed it, so they made it like whatever in Paris, in Bradford, where the tournament was. And it got really heated, like really heated. It kind of happened on social media. So someone had written a post and put a picture with that on it, and it just got really like out of hand. And I remember like me and the boy reported it, and after that, like no one on the team spoke to me again. And then I think I left, and then the year after, I had like a game where like the team leader kind of person, she wouldn't shake my hand, like when we finished the game. And I think for a long time it made me feel like if you speak out, you will face consequences. And it made me be tolerant against like athletes speaking out about anything for a very long time. And it wasn't until like I think a few like years ago that I was like, actually, no, you know, I wasn't in the wrong for saying, you know, that's racism. They were in the wrong. And instead of them like acknowledging what they did was wrong and take responsibility for it, I was the one who was like pushed out of the space. And yeah, so that was my first proper experience of racism in sport.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's something that is really that you feel like when you do it for the first time, where you say, I took this decision, you know, now I have to kind of live with speaking out. But also if you wouldn't have done it, you know, can't just keep accepting things that are unacceptable. But it's really interesting that you say you kind of got pushed out of that field, because it's very similar when you are in the workplace in specific environments and when you speak out, and the consensus is calm down, you know, it's really not that big of a deal. And you're kind of like, oh, okay, so I'm like the only one here. And you feel the energy changing afterwards, after you spoke out. So it's really kind of interesting to see how you can build a space where you don't have to, in the first place, don't have to really start this discussion. But you also can't always remove yourself, right?
Yeah. And I think part of it was also like, and I don't know how important this is to share, but like it's kind of important. But I feel like there's always a person who's digestible in the room. And like when I spoke out, me and another boy, I think that boy was from Nigeria and I was from Sudan. So we were both like African from Africa, you know, and that had grown up in Britain. And we were the only two saying that's wrong. And then there was a boy who was actually like mixed race, and he was saying, no, like you guys are overreacting. So everyone kind of took his word, you know, for it. And it was kind of like there's so many times in life where somebody takes like the position to say something is not a big deal, but they don't look back to see like the people who, I don't want to say more authentic, but the people who actually, you know, like we're fully like African, we're from Africa, like we're sitting here telling you like we don't like the use of the N-word, and you're sitting there being like, oh no, it's fine, you know. And I struggled a lot with that, like over the years, this idea of like people seem to have a louder voice because other people feel like they are the spokesperson, you know.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I remember I did a podcast about wokeness and the traps of wokeness, of it coming across a lot of times as moral superiority. But there's also a line where, and I remember saying that I think light-skinned people of color are in the best position to actually speak out about racism and things that are not okay, because they are kind of more accessible to people that are, you know, have issues with racism or are outright racist. They would listen more to light-skinned people of color and take their word. So you're kind of in a position where you need to really be conscious about how you come across. And at the same time, I also feel like there shouldn't be anyone saying it's fine to someone else's feelings. Like, how are you in a position to say it's fine when someone else says this is not fine for me? It's, you know, it's the same thing as if you would give your opinion to anything else and I would say your opinion is wrong. It's your opinion. It's like there's no one else that could speak out about your opinion than yourself. So thanks for sharing that. I do want to go to one more question, and that has to do with your really push as well to change something in the industry. And you're kind of in the limbo of you were you were someone from the grassroots level, but now you're kind of in the elite level of working with big brands, having a lot of reach, mashallah. And I wanted you to, so the third question is actually about that.
How can we bridge the gap between grassroots activists and the elite athletes? And women like you who are already successful and well known in their field. For example, if you take me as who is in the initial stage of my career, and if I look at you and a person like Sina Port in the sport industry doing well, what are the ways we can bridge the gap between these two activists in the industry? One is that is already elite and established, and the second is who is at the grassroots level.
I think a lot of brands and companies and stuff need to understand like what is it that they're trying to share, because sometimes, you know, when people are bringing in people who have already made it, who have already like got lots and lots and lots of followers, they're bringing them in for numbers, and sometimes they may not be the people who are actually genuinely on the ground doing a lot of the work, or they're doing the work but they've only done it for like a couple of months, you know, but as someone who's been doing it for 10 years. So a lot of these brands need to kind of figure out, like, are we trying to tell authentic stories and bring people who have been making real change, or are we trying to bring in people because of their numbers? And I think once these brands kind of understand, like, okay, we're doing it for the number, then they need to kind of check themselves, because, you know, everything can't always be about the numbers, you know. And but at the same time, if you're gonna, you know, do numbers, then I don't think the whole entire, like, for example, if it's a panel discussion, then the whole panel discussion can't all be people who have bigger following. What you need to do is then bring in like a diverse range, you know, so you have the people with a huge following, the people who are, you know, not such a huge following, and what then that does is kind of balances out in a sense, because then you get you know, like advice or like the stories of different people from different backgrounds. And it sounds really bad, but we're gonna say it anyway, but like then these people with the bigger following, their audience can be exposed to other people too, so then you help the other person grow. I understand how collaborations on social media can help someone grow a lot quicker by, you know, by one person amplifying their voice, or by two people sort of like putting their name on a specific video, and then it reaches like two sets of individuals. So I would say like to just make a conscious effort to constantly seek out, you know, go into the neighborhoods, the spaces, the sports industries, you know, where you might, you know, you're not seeing them on social media. You know, you just need to go in there and learn a bit more about them. In my city, there's so many sports, like so many sports clubs that I had no idea existed. And then like I think it was like 2 summers ago, I discovered they had like a whole cricket team, women, girls one, and then they had like a whole like rounders, which is like baseball. And then I already knew about like the jiu-jitsu because I was kind of like part of that, but then they have like cycling, and they have like all these different like things that were going on, but no one knew they existed, apart from the people who, you know, go there on a weekly basis, who are like sending their kids there. And those are the spaces that, you know, do deserve a lot of like, you know, brand support, or, you know, whatever, you know, these little communities kind of need support in.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's easier than you might think, where you can just approach a person and say, you know, this works really well with what you're doing already. Maybe we can collaborate. And the world is not a zero-sum game. I think a lot of times when people think, oh, I don't want to share my platform because then people would actually move away, but they're not moving away. They're also following another person. And maybe that person's followers are also getting exposed to you. So it's not either them or me. It's about how can we grow together and kind of, you know, come together, because you can't do everything by yourself and alone. There's just be so boring and really overwhelming as well if you're trying to just make it on your own or change the entire game on your own. So I love what you're saying. Definitely bringing that diversity together and sharing your diversity. Here we go. So we come to the last question, which is, what do you want to hear from the audience from anything that we've talked about today? We've talked about sports, about your personal brand, about art, and really discovering your passion, about creating spaces. What do you want to hear from the audience? What is a question you have for the audience that they can answer in the comments below?
Sure. Why do I need to suddenly cough? So I think what I would want to hear is like, oh, it's really bad.
Drink something.
The kitchen is so far, like I have to jump over. Anyway. I think what I would want to hear from the audience is like, what sports do they play, and any like barriers or like success stories that they have. Like, what is it that, what content do they want to see more of by people like me that would inspire them, you know?
So thank you so much for taking the time during their move to come on this podcast. I'm excited to chat more. I'm very sure you're going to be a recurring guest on the podcast. For those questions that Asma asked, leave those down in the comments and share diversity. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
If you love this video, please make sure that you like and subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear this. And I'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum.